Chapter 1. Arrival. The mud clung to my boots like a living thing, sucking at each step, as if the earth itself was trying to pull me down into the grave it had become for so many. It was late August 2025, and the sun hung low over the Donetsk Oblast, casting long shadows across the scarred landscape. My name is Oleksandr, a 28-year-old from Lviv, once a mechanic fixing cars in a quiet garage, now a rifleman in the Ukrainian armed forces. I'd been mobilized 6 months earlier, trained in the basics of survival in this hellish war, but nothing prepared me for the front at Pokrovsk Dobropillya. We arrived in a convoy of battered Kam-Az trucks, rumbling along potholed roads that had been shelled into craters. The air smelled of diesel fumes mixed with the acrid tang of gunpowder that never seemed to dissipate. To the north, Dobropillya loomed like a ghost town, its buildings pockmarked by artillery strikes, windows shattered like broken eyes staring back at us. Pokrovsk, a key logistical hub, was just to the south, its importance drilled into us during briefings. Hold it, or the Russians could push deeper into our heartland. Our platoon, part of the 157th Mechanized Brigade, was deployed to reinforce the line after reports of Russian breakthroughs. ISW assessments we'd heard about painted a grim picture, Russian forces advancing steadily, capturing square kilometers in Lyman, Pokrovsk, and Dobropillya fronts. In August alone, they'd gained over 13 square kilometers in Dobropillya, pushing with mechanized assaults and drone swarms. But we were here to stabilize, to counterattack if needed. As we dismounted, Sergeant Kovalenko barked orders, his voice hoarse from shouting over explosions. Dig in, positions along the tree line, drones are everywhere, keep low. The ground was soft from recent rains, and we shoveled frantically, creating foxholes amid the remnants of sunflower fields turned to mush. The distant boom of artillery echoed, a constant reminder that the enemy was close. I could hear the whine of FPV drones overhead, those cheap killers that had become the scourge of the battlefield. My hands trembled as I checked my AK-74, the metal cold against my skin. Beside me, Petro, a burly farmer from Vinnytsia, muttered prayers under his breath. We'd bonded during training, sharing stories of home to drown out the fear. Remember Mariupol, he said, eyes fierce. We don't break, but inside, my heart pounded like a drum, adrenaline surging with every unexplained rustle in the bushes. That first night, the tension built like a storm. Around midnight, flares lit the sky, revealing silhouettes of Russian positions less than 2 kilometers away. Intelligence reported their first Azov Army Corps. Wait, no, that's ours. The Russians had their own units, like the 90th Guards Tank Division, probing our defenses. A sudden barrage hit, shells whistling in like vengeful spirits. I dove into my hole, dirt raining down as explosions shook the ground. The smell of cordite burned my nostrils, and screams pierced the night. Someone hit, medics rushing through the chaos. By dawn, we'd repelled a small probe, our javelin missiles taking out 2 IFVs advancing from the east. But losses mounted. A drone strike claimed our radio man, his body twisted in the mud. The front was fluid, with Ukrainian reserves stabilizing the Dobropillya breakthrough as per General Staff reports. We detected and eliminated Russian sabotage groups, their attempts to fortify foiled by our vigilance. Yet the spanning, the suspense, was unrelenting. Every shadow could be an enemy, every silence a prelude to attack. I clutched my rifle tighter, eyes scanning the horizon, knowing this was just the beginning. Chapter 2. The line holds. The dawn broke over Pokrovsk Dobropillya with a sickly yellow hue, the sky bruised by smoke and the promise of more violence. I hadn't slept, not really, just brief moments of dozing between the distant thuds of artillery and the constant hum of drones. My foxhole, barely a meter deep, was my world now, its damp walls a fragile shield against the chaos. The air was thick with the stench of wet earth, cordite, and something worse, decay, creeping in from the unburied dead scattered across no man's land. Our position, a ragged line of trenches and foxholes stretching along a low ridge, was critical. Intelligence updates, trickling through our battered radios, confirmed Russian forces, elements of the 90th Guards Tank Division and irregular units were massing for another push. The ISW reported they'd gained ground in nearby Seladov, just 10 kilometers east, and their drones were relentless, spotting our movements with deadly precision. We were ordered to hold, to blunt their advance before they could threaten Pokrovsk's supply lines. Sergeant Kovalenko gathered us at first light, his face etched with exhaustion but hard as steel. "They're coming," he said, spitting into the mud. T-72s, BMPs, maybe a company of infantry. We've got javelins and Stugners, but it's our rifles that'll make the difference. "Stay sharp." Petro, crouched beside me, checked his PKM machine gun, his fingers steady despite the fear in his eyes. "For my daughter," he whispered, clutching a photo tucked inside his helmet. The morning passed in tense silence, broken only by the crackle of radio chatter and the occasional scream of a Grad rocket landing too close. Around 10 a.m., the ground trembled, a low rumble, like an approaching storm. "Tanks," someone shouted. I peered over the lip of my foxhole, heart racing, and saw them. 3 T-72s, their turrets swiveling, crawling across the shattered fields 800 meters out. Behind them, infantry moved in loose formation, using the wrecks of earlier battles for cover. "Javelins now," Kovalenko roared. A missile streaked from our line, its contrail slicing the air. The lead tank erupted in a fireball, its turret blown skyward. Cheers rose, but they were short-lived. Russian drones buzzed like hornets, and a kamikaze FPV slammed into a nearby position, the explosion hurling dirt and screams into the air. I ducked, my ears ringing, as Petro opened fire, his machine gun chattering in controlled bursts. "Keep them pinned," he yelled. The infantry came next, a wave of figures darting through the smoke. I aimed my AK-74, the sight trembling with my pulse. A Russian soldier, barely visible through the haze, dropped as my rounds found their mark. But they kept coming, their AKs flashing in response. Bullets snapped overhead, kicking up dirt. Somewhere to my left, a scream cut off abruptly, a comrade gone. My mouth was dry, fear clawing at my chest, but I fired again, the recoil jarring my shoulder. Our Stugner P teams worked miracles, knocking out 2 more armored vehicles, but the Russians pressed hard, their mortars pounding our line. A shell landed 20 meters away, showering me with shrapnel and mud. I checked myself, still whole somehow. Petro wasn't so lucky, a gash bled across his forearm, but he waved off the medic, cursing as he reloaded. By noon, the attack faltered. Ukrainian artillery, firing from behind Pokrovsk, rained 155 shells on the Russian positions, guided by our spotters. The enemy pulled back, leaving burning hulks and bodies in their wake. We'd held, but at a cost. Our platoon lost 4 men, 2 wounded badly enough to be evacuated. The general staff later reported we'd disrupted a key Russian assault, preventing a breakthrough toward Dobropillya. As night fell, I sat in my foxhole, eating a cold MRE, my hands shaking not from cold, but from the adrenaline crash. Petro, bandaged now, offered me a cigarette. "We are still here," he said, his voice hollow. I nodded, staring at the stars through the smoke, wondering how long our luck would hold. Chapter 3, Breaking Point. The third day on the Pokrovsk Dobropillya front felt like a lifetime trapped in a single breath. The air was heavy, not just with the smoke of burning vehicles or the damp chill of late August, but with the weight of exhaustion that settled into our bones. My name is Oleksandr, and the trench I called home now smelled of sweat, blood, and fear. The Russian push hadn't stopped. Reports from the general staff confirmed they were regrouping, their drones still circling like vultures, and their artillery hammering our positions with relentless precision. The ISW noted a surge in Russian assaults, with over 40 attacks repelled in the Pokrovsk sector alone in the past 48 hours. Our platoon was down to 22 men, a third of our original strength. The wounded were piling up faster than the medics could handle, and supplies were running low, ammunition, water, even bandages. Sergeant Kovalenko, his face now gaunt, gathered us in the pre-dawn gloom. "They're probing again," he said, his voice a low growl. "Expect heavy armor and dismounted infantry. We've got reinforcements coming, but we hold until then." His eyes met mine, and I saw the unspoken truth. We were stretched thin, and the Russians knew it. The morning started with a barrage, 150 tomb shells screaming in from the east, tearing up the ground and sending shrapnel singing through the air. I crouched in my foxhole, clutching my AK-74, the stock slick with mud. Petro, his arms still bandaged from yesterday's fight, manned his PKM beside me, his jaw set like stone. "They won't break us," he muttered, more to himself than me, but the fear was there, in the way his hands gripped the gun, in the way we all flinched at every explosion. At 700, the attack came. First, the drones, FPVs and reconnaissance quadcopters, their high-pitched whines cutting through the chaos. One slammed into a nearby trench, the blast shaking the earth and silencing a machine gun nest. Then the tanks appeared, 5 T-90s rolling through the mist, their coaxial guns spitting fire. Behind them, infantry advanced, using the terrain, shell craters, ruined farmhouses for cover. Our javelin teams fired, but the Russians had adapted, deploying smoke screens to obscure our targeting. I fired burst after burst, my rifle's muzzle flashing in the dim light. A Russian soldier fell, then another, but they kept coming, their numbers overwhelming. "Grenades!" Kovalenko shouted, and we lobbed F-1s into the advancing wave. Explosions ripped through their ranks, but the cost was high. A sniper's bullet found our grenadier, Dimitro, his body slumping against the trench wall. I dragged him down, his blood warm on my hands, but his eyes were already empty. The battle raged for hours, a brutal dance of fire and steel. Our Stugna-P teams scored hits, disabling 2 tanks, but a Russian Su-25 roared overhead, its rockets tearing into our rear positions. The radio crackled with desperate calls for artillery support, but our 155 guns were slow to respond, low on shells, we later learned. Petro's PKM ran dry, and he switched to his rifle, cursing as he fumbled with a magazine. "Stay with me, Sasha," he yelled, using my nickname, his voice raw with defiance. By mid-afternoon, the line was buckling. A Russian BMP broke through on our left flank, its 13 cannon raking our positions. I saw comrades fall, their screams drowned by the roar of battle. Kovalenko rallied us, leading a counterattack with Molotovs and RPGs. We stopped the BMP, its crew bailing out only to be cut down, but the effort cost us. Kovalenko took shrapnel to the leg, and I helped him to cover, his blood soaking my uniform. Reinforcements arrived at dusk, elements of the 25th Airborne Brigade, their BMDs rolling up to bolster our line. Ukrainian artillery finally found its mark, pounding the Russian positions and forcing a retreat. The General Staff later reported we'd held Pokrovsk Dobropillya, disrupting a major offensive, but the cost was staggering. Our platoon was down to 15 men, and the trench was littered with spent casings and the ghosts of the fallen. As night fell, I sat beside Petro, sharing a canteen of water that tasted of dirt. "We are still here," he said, echoing his words from yesterday, but his voice cracked. I looked at the horizon, where flares lit the sky like dying stars, and felt the weight of survival pressing down. The breaking point was close for all of us. Chapter 4, Dawn of Resolve. The 4th day at Pokrovsk Dobropillya broke with a quiet that felt unnatural, like the world holding its breath before a scream. The air was crisp, carrying the faint metallic tang of blood and the ever-present smoke that clung to everything. Oleksandr sat in my trench, my AK-74 cradled in my lap, its barrel cold from the night. My body ached, every muscle screaming from days of relentless combat, but my mind was sharper now, honed by survival. The front had become a crucible, burning away doubt and leaving only resolve. Our platoon, now a skeleton crew of 15, was battered but unbroken. The General Staff's morning brief, crackling through a patched-up radio, reported that Russian forces, remnants of the 90th Guards Tank Division and irregular units, were regrouping after their failed offensive. The ISW confirmed they'd lost significant ground in the Pokrovsk sector, with Ukrainian counterattacks reclaiming key positions near Dobropillya. But the cost was etched in the faces around me. Petro, his eyes hollow but defiant. Mykola, a young recruit, shaking as he cleaned his rifle, and Sergeant Kovalenko, limping but refusing to leave the line. At 600, Kovalenko gathered us, his voice steady despite the pain. "We're not just holding today," he said, pointing toward the Russian lines. "We push. The 25th Airborne's with us, and we've got drone support. We take that ridge, cut their supply line." The plan was bold. A counterattack to seize a low hill 1.5 kilometers east, a vantage point the Russians used for artillery spotting. If we succeeded, it could disrupt their operations, maybe buy Pokrovsk a breather. The assault began at dawn. Our All-in-10 drones scouted ahead, feeding grainy footage to our command. Ukrainian artillery opened up, 155 shells pounding the Russian positions as we advanced under cover of smoke. I moved with Petro's squad, my boots sinking into the churned earth, heart pounding as we crossed open ground. The Russians responded with mortars, shells bursting around us, spraying mud and shrapnel. A scream to my right, Mykola, hit in the shoulder, collapsing into a crater. I dragged him to cover, his blood slick on my hands, and yelled for a medic. We reached the base of the ridge, using shell craters for cover. Russian infantry held the high ground, their AKs and RPKs spitting fire. Petro's PKM roared, pinning them down as our squad flanked left. I tossed a smoke grenade, its hiss masking our movement, and we climbed, scrambling over rocks and roots. A Russian sniper fired, the crack of his SVD splitting the air. The man beside me dropped, a clean hole in his helmet. I froze, bile rising, but Petro's shout, "Move, Sasha," snapped me back. At the crest, it was chaos. Hand-to-hand, bayonets flashing, screams mingling with gunfire. I fired point-blank, my rounds cutting down a Russian soldier as he lunged. Our drones struck, FPVs slamming into their dugouts, turning fortifications into fireballs. Kovalenko, blood seeping through his bandage, led the final push, his pistol barking. By 900, the ridge was ours. We dug in, panting, as Russian artillery retaliated, shells falling short but close enough to shake the earth. The victory was costly. We lost 3 more, and Mykola was evacuated, his fate uncertain. But the general staff reported our counterattack had disrupted Russian logistics, forcing them to redirect forces. Pokrovsk Dobropillya held, a fragile line in a brutal war. As night fell, I stood on the ridge, watching the horizon glow with distant explosions. Petro joined me, his face streaked with dirt. "For Ukraine," he said, his voice soft but firm. I nodded, feeling the weight of those words, knowing we'd fight again tomorrow. Epilogue: the ridge at Pokrovsk Dobropillya stood silent under a grey September sky, its scars a testament to the battles fought. I, Oleksandr, leaned against my rifle, the weight of survival heavy on my shoulders. Our counterattack had held the line, but the war stretched on, a relentless tide. Petro's voice echoed in my mind, "For Ukraine," as I looked toward the horizon where new battles loomed. The front had forged us, broken us, and yet we stood, ready to fight again.